Chapter 6 of Allan and the Holy Flower. This Librivox Recording is in the public domain. Allan and the Holy Flower by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 6 The Slave Road. The 20 bearers having arrived, in charge of 5 or 6 Arabs armed with guns, we went to inspect them, taking Hassan with us, also the hunters. They were a likely lot of men, though rather thin and scared looking, and evidently, as I could see from their physical appearance and varying methods of dressing the hair, members of different tribes. Having delivered them, the Arabs, or rather one of them, entered into excited conversation with Hassan. As Sammy was not at hand, I do not know what was said, although I gathered that they were contemplating his rescue. If so, they gave up the idea and began to run away as their companions had done. One of them, however, a bolder fellow than the rest, turned and fired at me. He missed by some yards, as I could tell from the sing of the bullet, for these Arabs are execrable shots. Still, his attempt at murder irritated me so much that I determined he should not go scot-free. I was carrying the little rifle called Intombi, that with which, as Hans had reminded me, I shot the vulture at Dingaan's kraal many years before. Of course, I could have killed the man, but this I did not wish to do. Or I could have shot him through the leg, but then we should have had to nurse him or leave him to die. So I selected his right arm, which was outstretched as he fled, and at about 50 paces put a bullet through it just above the elbow. "There," I said to the Zulus as I saw it double up, "that low fellow will never shoot at anyone again." "Pretty, Macumazahn, very pretty," said Mavovo. "But as you can aim so well, why not have chosen his head? That bullet is half wasted." Next I set to work to get into communication with the bearers, who thought, poor devils, that they had been but sold to a new master. Here I may explain that they were slaves not meant for exportation, but men kept to cultivate Hassan's gardens. Fortunately I found that 2 of them belonged to the Mazitu people, who, it may be remembered, are the same blood as the Zulus, although they separated from the parent stock generations ago. These men talked a dialect that I could understand, though at first not very easily. The foundation of it was Zulu, but it had become much mixed with the languages of other tribes whose women the Mazitu had taken to wife. Also there was a man who could speak some bastard Arabic sufficiently well for Sammy to converse with him. I asked the Mazitus if they knew of the way back to their country. They answered yes, but it was far off, a full month's journey. I told them that if they would guide us thither they should receive their freedom and good pay, adding that if the other men served us well they also should be set free when we had done with them. On receiving this information the poor wretches smiled in a sickly fashion and looked at Hassan ben Mohammed, who glowered at them and us from the box on which he was seated in charge of Mavovo. "How can we be free while that man lives?" their look seemed to say. As though to confirm their doubts, Hassan, who understood or guessed what was passing, asked by what right we were promising freedom to his slaves. "By right of that," I answered, pointing to the Union Jack which Stephen still had in his hand. "Also we will pay you for them when we return, according as they have served us." "Yes," he muttered, "you will pay me for them when you return, or perhaps before that, Englishman." It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon before we were able to make a start. There was so much to be arranged that it might have been wiser to wait till the morrow, had we not determined that if we could help it nothing would induce us to spend another night in that place. Blankets were served out to each of the bearers, who, poor naked creatures, seemed quite touched at the gift of them. The loads were apportioned, having already been packed at Durban in cases such as one man could carry. The pack saddles were put upon the 4 donkeys, which proved to be none the worse for their journey, and burdens to a weight of about 100 pounds each fixed on them in waterproof hide bags, besides cooking calabashes and sleeping mats which Hans produced from somewhere. Probably he stole them out of the deserted village, but as they were necessary to us, I confess I asked no questions. Lastly, 6 or 8 goats which were wandering about were captured to take with us for food till we could find game. For these I offered to pay Hassan, but when I handed him the money he threw it down in a rage, so I picked it up and put it in my pocket again with a clear conscience. At length everything was more or less ready, and the question arose as to what was to be done with Hassan. The Zulus, like Hans, wished to kill him, as Sammy explained to him in his best Arabic. Then this murderous fellow showed what a coward he was at heart. He flung himself upon his knees, he wept, he invoked us in the name of the compassionate Allah, who, he explained, was after all the same God that we worshipped, till Mavovo, growing impatient of the noise, threatened him with his kerrie, whereupon he became silent. The easy-natured Stephen was for letting him go, a plan that seemed to have advantages, for then at least we should be rid of his abominable company. After reflection, however, I decided that we had better take him along with us, at any rate for a day or so, to hold us hostage in case the Arabs should follow and attack us. At first he refused to stir, but the assegai of one of the Zulu hunters, pressed gently against what remained of his robe, furnished an argument that he could not resist. At length we were off. I with the 2 guides went ahead, then came the bearers, then half of the hunters, then the 4 donkeys in charge of Hans and Sammy, then Hassan and the rest of the hunters, except Mavovo, who brought up the rear with Stephen. Needless to say, all our rifles were loaded, and generally we were prepared for any emergency. The only path, that which the guide said we must follow, ran by the seashore for a few hundred yards, and then turned inland through Hassan's village where he lived, for it seemed that the old mission house was not used by him. As we marched along a little rocky cliff, it was not more than 10 feet high, where a deep-water channel, perhaps 50 yards in breadth, separated the mainland from the island whence the slaves had been loaded on to the Maria, some difficulty arose about the donkeys. One of these slipped its load, and another began to buck and evinced an inclination to leap into the sea with its precious burden. The rearguard of hunters ran to get hold of it, when suddenly there was a splash. "The brute's in," I thought to myself, till a shout told me that not the ass, but Hassan had departed over the cliff's edge. Watching his opportunity, and being, it was clear, a first-rate swimmer, he had flung himself backwards in the midst of the confusion, and falling into deep water promptly dived. About 20 yards from the shore he came up for a moment, then dived again, heading for the island. I dare say I could have potted him through the head with a snapshot, but somehow I did not like to kill a man swimming for his life as though he were a hippopotamus or a crocodile. Moreover, the boldness of the manoeuvre appealed to me. So I refrained from firing and called to the others to do likewise. As our late host approached the shore of the island, I saw Arabs running down the rocks to help him out of the water. Either they had not left the place, or had reoccupied it as soon as HMS Crocodile had vanished with her prize. As it was clear that to recapture Hassan would involve an attack upon the garrison of the island which we were in no position to carry out, I gave orders for the march to be resumed. These, the difficulty with the donkey having been overcome, were obeyed at once. It was fortunate that we did not delay, for scarcely had the caravan got into motion when the Arabs on the island began to fire at us. Luckily no one was hit, and we were soon round a point and under cover, also their shooting was as bad as usual. One missile, however, it was a pot-leg, struck a donkey load and smashed a bottle of good brandy and a tin of preserved butter. This made me angry, so motioning to the others to proceed, I took shelter behind a tree and waited till a torn and dirty turban, which I recognized as that of Hassan, poked up above a rock. Well, I put a bullet through that turban, for I saw the thing fly, but unfortunately not through the head beneath it. Having left this PPC card on our host, I bolted from the rock and caught up the others. Presently we passed round the village. Through it I would not go for fear of an ambuscade. It was quite a big place, enclosed with a strong fence, but hidden from the sea by a rise in the intervening land. In the centre was a large eastern-looking house, where doubtless Hassan dwelt with his harem. After we had gone a little way further, to my astonishment I saw flames breaking out from the palm-leaf roof of this house. At the time I could not imagine how this happened, but when, a day or two later, I observed Hans wearing a pair of large and very handsome gold pendants in his ears, and a gold bracelet on his wrist, and found that he and one of the hunters were extremely well set up in the matter of British sovereigns, well, I had my doubts. In due course the truth came out. He and the hunter, an adventurous spirit, slipped through a gate in the fence without being observed, ran across the deserted village to the house, stole the ornaments and money from the women's apartments, and as they departed fired the place, in exchange for the bottle of good brandy, as Hans explained. I was inclined to be angry, but after all, as we had been fired on, Hans's exploit became an act of war rather than a theft. So I made him and his companion divide the gold equally with the rest of the hunters, who no doubt had kept their eyes conveniently shut, not forgetting Sammy, and said no more. They netted £8 apiece, which pleased them very much. In addition to this I gave £1 each, or rather goods to that value, to the bearers as their share of the loot. Hassan, I remarked, was evidently a great agriculturalist, for the gardens which he worked by slave labour were beautiful, and must have brought him in a large revenue. Passing through these gardens we came to sloping land covered with bush. Here the track was not too good, for the creepers hampered our progress. Indeed, I was very glad when towards sunset we reached the crest of a hill and emerged upon a tableland which was almost clear of trees and rose gradually till it met the horizon. In that bush we might easily have been attacked, but in this open country I was not so much afraid, since the loss of the Arabs would have been great before we were overpowered. As a matter of fact, although spies dogged us for days, no assault was ever attempted. Finding a convenient place by a stream, we camped for the night, but as it was so fine did not pitch the tents. Afterwards I was sorry we had not gone further from the water, since the mosquitoes bred by millions in the marshes bordering the stream gave us a dreadful time. On poor Stephen, fresh from England, they fell with peculiar ferocity, with the result that in the morning, what between the bruises left by Hassan and their bites, he was a spectacle for men and angels. Another thing that broke our rest was the necessity of keeping a strict watch in case the slave traders should elect to attack us in the hours of darkness. Also to guard against the possibility of our bearers running away and perhaps stealing the goods. It is true that before they went to sleep I explained to them very clearly that any of them who attempted to give us the slip would certainly be seen and shot, whereas if they remained with us they would be treated with every kindness. They answered through the two Mazitu that they had nowhere to go, and did not wish to fall again into the power of Hassan, of whom they spoke literally with shudders, pointing the while to their scarred backs and the marks of the slave yokes upon their necks. Their protestations seemed, and indeed proved to be sincere, but of this of course we could not then be sure. As I was engaged at sunrise in making certain that the donkeys had not strayed, and generally that all was well, I noted through the thin mist a little white object, which at first I thought was a small bird sitting on an upright stick about 50 yards from the camp. I went towards it and discovered that it was not a bird, but a folded piece of paper stuck in a cleft wand, such as natives often use for the carrying of letters. I opened the letter and with great difficulty, for the writing within was bad Portuguese, read as follows: English devils, do not think that you have escaped me. I know where you are going, and if you live through that journey it will be but to die at my hands after all. I tell you that I have at my command 300 brave men armed with guns who worship Allah and thirst for the blood of Christian dogs. With these I will follow, and if you fall into my hands alive, you shall learn what it is to die by fire or pinned over ant-heaps in the sun. Let us see if your English man of war will help you then, or your false god either. Misfortune go with you, white-skinned robbers of honest men. This pleasing epistle was unsigned, but its anonymous author was not hard to identify. I showed it to Stephen, who was so infuriated at its contents that he managed to dab some ammonia with which he was treating his mosquito bites into his eye. When at length the pain was soothed by bathing, we concocted this answer: Murderer, known among men as Hassan ben Mohammed, truly we sinned in not hanging you when you were in our power. Oh, wolf who grows fat upon the blood of the innocent, this is a fault that we shall not commit again. Your death is near to you, and we believe at our hands. Come with all your villains whenever you will. The more there are of them the better we shall be pleased, who would rather rid the world of many fiends than of a few. Till we meet again, Allan Quatermain, Stephen Somers. Neat, if not Christian, I said when I had read the letter over. Yes, replied Stephen, but perhaps just a little bombastic in tone. If that gentleman did arrive with 300 armed men, eh? Then, my boy, I answered, in this way or in that we shall thrash him. I don't often have an inspiration, but I've got one now, and it is to the effect that Mr. Hassan has not very long to live, and that we shall be intimately connected with his end. Wait till you have seen a slave caravan, and you will understand my feelings. Also I know these gentry. That little prophecy of ours will get on his nerves and give him a foretaste of things. Hans, go and set this letter in that cleft stick. The postman will call for it before long." As it happened, within a few days we did see a slave caravan, some of the merchandise of the estimable Hassan. We had been making good progress through a beautiful and healthy country, steering almost due west, or rather a little to the north of the west. The land was undulating and rich, well watered and only bush clad in the neighbourhood of the streams, the higher ground being open, of a park-like character, and dotted here and there with trees. It was evident that once, and not very long ago, the population had been dense, for we came to the remains of many villages, or rather towns with large market-places. Now, however, these were burned with fire or deserted, or occupied only by a few old bodies who got a living from the overgrown gardens. These poor people, who sat desolate and crooning in the sun, or perhaps worked feebly at the once fertile fields, would fly screaming at our approach, for to them men armed with guns must of necessity be slave traders. Still, from time to time we contrived to catch some of them, and through one member of our party or the other to get at their stories. Really, it was all one story. The slaving Arabs, on this pretext or on that, had set tribe against tribe. Then they sided with the stronger and conquered the weaker by aid of their terrible guns, killing out the old folk and taking the young men, women and children, except the infants, whom they butchered to be sold as slaves. It seemed that the business had begun about 20 years before, when Hassan ben Mohammed and his companions arrived at Kilwa and drove away the missionary who had built a station there. At first this trade was extremely easy and profitable, since the raw material lay near at hand in plenty. By degrees, however, the neighbouring communities had been worked out. Countless numbers of them were killed, while the pick of the population passed under the slave yoke, and those of them who survived vanished in ships to unknown lands. Thus it came about that the slavers were obliged to go further afield, and even to conduct their raids upon the borders of the territory of the great Mazitu people, the inland race of Zulu origin of whom I have spoken. According to our informants, it was even rumoured that they proposed shortly to attack these Mazitus in force, relying on their guns to give them the victory, and open to them a new and almost inexhaustible store of splendid human merchandise. Meanwhile they were clearing out certain small tribes which hitherto had escaped them, owing to the fact that they had their residence in bush or among difficult hills. The track we followed was the recognized slave road. Of this we soon became aware by the numbers of skeletons which we found lying in the tall grass at its side, some of them with heavy slave sticks still upon their wrists. These, I suppose, had died from exhaustion, but others, as their split skulls showed, had been disposed of by their captors. On the 8th day of our march we struck the track of a slave caravan. It had been travelling towards the coast, but for some reason or other had turned back. This may have been because its leaders had been warned of the approach of our party, or perhaps they had heard that another caravan, which was at work in a different district, was drawing near, bringing its slaves with it, and wished to wait for its arrival in order that they might join forces. The spoor of these people was easy to follow. First we found the body of a boy of about 10. Then vultures revealed to us the remains of 2 young men, one of whom had been shot and the other killed by a blow from an axe. Their corpses were roughly hidden beneath some grass, I know not why. A mile or 2 further on we heard a child wailing and found it by following its cries. It was a little girl of about 4 who had been pretty, though now she was but a living skeleton. When she saw us she scrambled away on all 4s like a monkey. Stephen followed her, while I, sick at heart, went to get a tin of preserved milk from our stores. Presently I heard him call to me in a horrified voice. Rather reluctantly, for I knew that he must have found something dreadful, I pushed my way through the bush to where he was. There, bound to the trunk of a tree, sat a young woman, evidently the mother of the child, for it clung to her leg. Thank God she was still living, though she must have died before another day dawned. We cut her loose, and the Zulu hunters, who are kind folk enough when they are not at war, carried her to camp. In the end, with much trouble, we saved the lives of that mother and child. I sent for the two Mazitos, with whom I could by now talk fairly well, and asked them why the slavers did these things. They shrugged their shoulders, and one of them answered with a rather dreadful laugh: "Because, Chief, these Arabs, being black-hearted, kill those who can walk no more, or tie them up to die. If they let them go they might recover and escape, and it makes the Arabs sad that those who have been their slaves should live to be free and happy." "Does it? Does it indeed?" exclaimed Stephen, with a snort of rage that reminded me of his father. "Well, if I ever get the chance I'll make them sad, with a vengeance." Stephen was a tender-hearted young man, and for all his soft and indolent ways, an awkward customer when roused. Within 48 hours he got his chance. Thus: that day we camped early for two reasons. The first was that the woman and child we had rescued were so weak that they could not walk without rest, and we had no men to spare to carry them. The second, that we came to an ideal spot to pass the night. It was, as usual, a deserted village through which ran a beautiful stream of water. Here we took possession of some outlying huts with a fence round them, and as Mavovo had managed to shoot a fat eland cow and her half-grown calf, we prepared to have a regular feast. Whilst Sammy was making some broth for the rescued woman, and Stephen and I smoked our pipes and watched him, Hans slipped through the broken gate of the thorn fence, or boma, and announced that Arabs were coming, 2 lots of them, with many slaves. We ran out to look, and saw that, as he had said, 2 caravans were approaching, or rather had reached the village, but at some distance from us, and were now camping on what had been the market-place. One of these was that whose track we had followed, although during the last few hours of our march we had struck away from it, chiefly because we could not bear such sights as I have described. It seemed to comprise about 250 slaves and over 40 guards, all black men carrying guns, and most of them by their dress Arabs, or bastard Arabs. In the second caravan, which approached from another direction, were not more than 100 slaves and about 20 or 30 captors. "Now," I said, "let us eat our dinner, and then, if you like, we will go to call upon those gentlemen, just to show that we are not afraid of them. Hans, get the flag and tie it to the top of the tree. It will show them to what country we belong." Up went the Union Jack duly, and presently through our glasses we saw the slavers running about in a state of excitement. Also we saw the poor slaves turn and stare at the bit of flapping bunting, and then begin to talk to each other. It struck me as possible that someone among their number had seen a Union Jack in the hands of an English traveller, or had heard of it as flying upon ships or at points on the coast, and what it meant to slaves. Or they may have understood some of the remarks of the Arabs, which no doubt were pointed and explanatory. At any rate, they turned and stared till the Arabs ran among them with sjamboks, that is, whips of hippopotamus hide, and suppressed their animated conversation with many blows. At first I thought that they would break camp and march away. Indeed, they began to make preparations to do this, then abandoned the idea, probably because the slaves were exhausted and there was no other water they could reach before nightfall. In the end they settled down and lit cooking fires. Also, as I observed, they took precautions against attack by stationing sentries and forcing the slaves to construct a boma of thorns about their camp. "Well," said Stephen, when we had finished our dinner, "are you ready for that call?" "No," I answered, "I do not think that I am. I have been considering things, and concluded that we had better leave well alone. By this time those Arabs will know all the story of our dealings with their worthy master Hassan, for no doubt he has sent messengers to them. Therefore, if we go to their camp they may shoot us at sight. Or, if they receive us well, they may offer hospitality and poison us, or cut our throats suddenly. Our position might be better, still it is one that I believe they would find difficult to take. So, in my opinion, we had better stop still and await developments." Stephen grumbled something about my being over-cautious, but I took no heed of him. One thing I did do, however. Sending for Hans, I told him to take one of the Mazitu, I dared not risk them both, for they were our guides, and another of the natives whom we had borrowed from Hassan, a bold fellow who knew all the local languages, and creep down to the slavers' camp as soon as it was quite dark. There I ordered him to find out what he could, and if possible to mix with the slaves and explain that we were their friends. Hans nodded, for this was exactly the kind of task that appealed to him, and went off to make his preparations. Stephen and I also made some preparations in the way of strengthening our defences, building large watch fires and setting sentries. The night fell, and Hans with his companions departed stealthily as snakes. The silence was intense, save for the occasional wailings of the slaves, which now and again broke out in bursts of melancholy sound, "La lu, la lu la," and then died away, to be followed by horrid screams as the Arabs laid their lashes upon some poor wretch. Once, too, a shot was fired. "They have seen Hans," said Stephen. "I think not," I answered, "for if so there would have been more than one shot. Either it was an accident or they were murdering a slave." After this nothing more happened for a long while, till at length Hans seemed to rise out of the ground in front of me, and behind him I saw the figures of the Mazitu and the other man. "Tell your story," I said. "Baas, it is this. Between us we have learned everything. The Arabs know all about you and what men you have. Hassan has sent them orders to kill you. It is well that you did not go to visit them, for certainly you would have been murdered. We crept near and overheard their talk. They purpose to attack us at dawn tomorrow morning unless we leave this place before, which they will know of as we are being watched." "And if so, what then?" I asked. "Then, Baas, they will attack as we are making up the caravan, or immediately afterwards as we begin to march." "Indeed. Anything more, Hans?" "Yes, Baas. These two men crept among the slaves and spoke with them. They are very sad, those slaves, and many of them have died of heart pain because they have been taken from their homes and do not know where they are going. I saw one die just now, a young woman. She was talking to another woman and seemed quite well, only tired, till suddenly she said in a loud voice, 'I am going to die that I may come back as a spirit and bewitch these devils till they are spirits too.' Then she called upon the fetish of her tribe, put her hands to her breast and fell down dead. At least," added Hans, spitting reflectively, "she did not fall quite down, because the slave stick held her head off the ground. The Arabs were very angry, both because she had cursed them and was dead. One of them came and kicked her body, and afterwards shot her little boy who was sick, because the mother had cursed them. But fortunately he did not see us, because we were in the dark, far from the fire." "Anything more, Hans?" "One thing, Baas. These two men lent the knives you gave them to two of the boldest among the slaves that they might cut the cords of the slave sticks and the other cords with which they were tied, and then pass them down the lines, that their brothers might do the same. But perhaps the Arabs will find out, and then the Mazitu and the other must lose their knives. That is all. Has the Baas got a little tobacco?" "Now, Stephen," I said, when Hans had gone and I had explained everything, "there are two courses open to us. Either we can try to give these gentlemen the slip at once, in which case we must leave the woman and child to their fate, or we can stop where we are and wait to be attacked." "I won't run," said Stephen sullenly. "It would be cowardly to desert that poor creature. Also we should have a worse chance marching. Remember Hans said that they are watching us." "Then you would wait to be attacked? Isn't there a third alternative, Quatermain? To attack them?" "That's the idea," I said. "Let us send for Mavovo." Presently he came and sat down in front of us, while I set out the case to him. "It is the fashion of my people to attack rather than to be attacked, and yet, my father, in this case my heart is against it. Hans," he called him in Blatu, a Zulu word which means spotted snake, that was the Hottentot's Kaffir name, "says that there are quite 60 of the yellow dogs, all armed with guns, whereas we have not more than 15, for we cannot trust the slave men. Also he says that they are within a strong fence and awake with spies out, so that it will be difficult to surprise them. But here, father, we are in a strong fence and cannot be surprised. Also, men who torture and kill women and children, except in war, must, I think, be cowards, and will come on faintly against good shooting, if indeed they come at all. Therefore I say, wait till the buffalo shall either charge or run. But the word is with you, Macumazahn, wise watcher by night, not with me, your hunter. Speak, you who are old in war, and I will obey." "You argue well," I answered. "Also another reason comes to my mind. Those Arab brutes may get behind the slaves, of whom we should butcher a lot without hurting them. Stephen, I think we had better see the thing through here." "All right, Quatermain. Only I hope that Mavovo is wrong in thinking that those blackguards may change their minds and run away." "Really, young man, you are becoming very bloodthirsty for an orchid grower," I remarked, looking at him. "Now, for my part, I devoutly hope that Mavovo is right, for let me tell you, if he isn't, it may be a nasty job." "I've always been peaceful enough up to the present," replied Stephen, "but the sight of those unhappy wretches of slaves with their heads cut open, and of the woman tied to a tree to starve—" "Make you wish to usurp the functions of God Almighty," I said. "Well, it is a natural impulse, and perhaps in the circumstances one that will not displease Him. And now, as we have made up our minds what we are going to do, let's get to business, so that these Arab gentlemen may find their breakfast ready when they come to call." End of Chapter 6